The storm that night wasn't just in the sky over the Cimarron territory. It was in the heart of every soul caught in its path. For Denise McGregor, it was the ghost of a past he couldn't outrun. For the woman who collapsed on his doorstep, it was the terror of a future she'd do anything to escape. She uttered 5 words that would forever alter the course of his life, a desperate plea that held the weight of a hidden war. "Please," she gasped, her voice a raw whisper against the gale. "Just take me." But when the lightning flashed, illuminating her face, Denise saw more than a woman in trouble. He saw a reckoning, and he knew with the certainty of a gunslinger sighting his mark that he was looking at his destiny. The wind howled like a banshee through the ponderosa pines surrounding Denise McGregor's homestead. It was a raw, untamed sound that matched the territory itself. A slice of New Mexico that hadn't yet been fully broken to the bit, a place where a man's survival depended on the strength of his back and the speed of his draw. Denise, a man carved from the very granite of the Sangre de Cristo mountains that loomed to the west, paid it no mind. He sat at his rough-hewn table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the cabin, cleaning his Colt Peacemaker with the practiced, almost reverent motions of a man who understood its purpose all too well. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He'd turned in his Texas Ranger badge 3 years ago, trading the relentless pursuit of others for the quiet solitude of this valley. He'd bought the land, built the cabin with his own 2 hands, and tried to build a wall around the memories that stalked him in the dead of night. Memories of fire, of screams he couldn't silence, of a promise he had failed to keep to the Dawson family. He had been too late. That failure was a brand on his soul hotter than any cattle iron. A sudden frantic whinny, sharp with panic, cut through the storm's roar. It was too close. His dog, a scruffy Airedale mix named Buck, shot up from his place by the hearth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Denise's hand froze over the cylinder of his Colt. He moved with a fluid economy, born of 100 dangerous nights, grabbing his weatherproof slicker and a Winchester rifle from the rack by the door. Stepping outside was like walking into a wall of wind and water. The rain came in horizontal sheets, turning the hard-packed earth of his yard into a slick, churning mud. Through the deluge he saw it a horse, its coat matted with mud and sweat flanks, heaving as it stood trembling, its reins tangled in a mess of sagebrush. And slumped over its neck was a figure. Denise approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the muck. The horse, a fine-boned mare, was clearly on its last legs. He gently took the reins, his voice a low, calming murmur. It was only then that he got a clear look at the rider. It was a woman. Her fine traveling clothes, what looked like it might have been blue silk, were torn and soaked through, clinging to a frame that seemed far too delicate for this harsh country. Her face was turned away, hidden by a cascade of dark, wet hair plastered to her cheek. With a grunt of effort, he eased her from the saddle. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. As he carried her toward the cabin, Buck sniffing anxiously at her heels, she stirred. Her head lolled back and her eyes fluttered open. In the intermittent flashes of lightning, he saw they were the color of moss after a spring rain, wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. He pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder and carried her inside, laying her gently on the cot he used as his bed. He stoked the fire, sending a cascade of warm, bright sparks up the chimney. As he turned back to her, she had pushed herself up onto one elbow, her gaze darting around the rustic interior as if expecting demons to leap from the shadows. "You're safe here," Denise said. his voice rough from disuse. For now. Her eyes locked onto his. They held a frantic intelligence, a desperate plea that went beyond her physical state. "He'll find me," she whispered, her voice ragged. "His men. They were right behind me." "Who's he?" Dinesh asked, pulling a wool blanket from his trunk. She shook her head, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She winced, trying to sit up further, her hand going to her side. Dinesh moved forward, gently, pushing her back down. "Easy now. You're spent." He draped the blanket over her, his movements methodical and impersonal. He was a man used to dealing with necessities, not sensitivities. But then she reached out her fingers, surprisingly strong, as they clamped around his wrist. The contact was like a static charge, a jolt that broke through his carefully constructed detachment. "Please," she begged, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Don't send me away. Don't turn me over to them. Whatever they offer you, whatever they promise, it's a lie." Her grip tightened. "Please just take me. Hide me. Anywhere. I'll work, I'll cook, I'll do anything. Just don't let him take me back." It was the plea of a trapped animal, and Dinesh had seen it before. He'd seen it in the eyes of homesteaders facing foreclosure, of rustled ranchers, of men about to be hanged. But in her, it was different. It wasn't just fear. It was a defiant, burning will to survive. He looked closer beyond the mud and the torn dress and the exhaustion. The lightning flashed again, a long, brilliant stroke that filled the cabin with stark white light. In that moment he saw her clearly, the proud set of her jaw, the unbroken spirit in her green eyes, the faint scar that cut through one eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that spoke of a life that hadn't been entirely soft. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter who had run out of ground. And in that instant, something shifted within Dinesh McGregor. The cold, hard wall around his heart cracked. It wasn't love at first sight, not the kind poets wrote about. It was something deeper, more primal. It was recognition. He saw in her the same desperate fight for a future that he had once championed and then abandoned. He saw a chance not just to save her, but to salvage a piece of his own lost soul. The ghosts of the Dawson family seemed to whisper in the wind, urging him on. This time, he wouldn't be too late. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this woman, this stranger delivered by the storm, was not just a fleeting problem. She was his future, a dangerous, complicated, and possibly fatal future, but a future nonetheless. He gently pried her fingers from his wrist and held her hand in his own calloused palm. "I won't turn you over," he said, the words feeling like a vow. "You can stay. What's your name?" Relief washed over her face, so potent it was as if she might break apart. "Lillian." She breathed, her eyes finally fluttering closed as the last of her strength gave out. Lillian Mayfair. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, the true tempest was just beginning. Dinesh looked down at the woman on his cot, then at the rifle still leaning against the door. He knew who a man like Bartholomew Kane was, a powerful rancher who ran the town of Redemption and most of this territory with an iron fist, a man whose reach was long and whose reputation was merciless. And Dinesh had just willingly stepped between him and something he wanted. He had just declared war. The dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The world outside Dinesh's cabin glistened every pine needle and blade of grass, jeweled with moisture. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brewing coffee wood smoke and antiseptic. Lillian Mayfair awoke to the gentle clinking of metal on ceramic. Her body ached with a profound weariness, but the gnawing terror of the previous night had receded, replaced by a fragile sense of safety. She was lying on a narrow cot tucked under a heavy wool blanket. A fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth. A man stood with his back to her at the stove, his broad shoulders filling out a simple flannel shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence that was somehow reassuring. She remembered his face from the lightning flash, hard angles, and Plain's eyes the color of a winter sky, and a stillness about him that seemed at odds with the violence she was fleeing. "You're awake," Denish said, without turning around. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. "There's stew on the stove. You need to eat." He brought a mug over to her. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked the land, yet his touch had been surprisingly gentle when he'd tended to her. She'd woken briefly in the night to find him cleaning a shallow, ugly gash on her ribs where a branch had torn through her dress and skin. He'd done it with an impersonal efficiency that left no room for modesty or fear. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse. She took the mug, her fingers brushing against his. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his tone flat. He sat at the table watching her over the rim of his own mug. "Trouble finds a man easy enough in this territory. I don't usually invite it in for breakfast." Lillian looked down into her coffee. "I told you I can work. I'm not afraid of it. It's not your work I'm worried about. It's the man you're running from." "Bartholomew Kane." Denish said the name as if it tasted foul. "He owns the town of Redemption, the sheriff, the bank, and half the ranchers in this basin. A man like that doesn't take kindly to his property going missing." "I am not his property." Lillian snapped a flash of the fire he'd seen earlier, returning to her eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Denish's lips. "Good, but he likely sees it different. He wanted to marry you, I take it." It was a question, but it felt like a test. Lillian hesitated, the full complicated truth, a dangerous weight on her tongue. She gave him the part of it that was simplest, the part that wouldn't send him running. "My father. He passed away a few months ago. He worked for Mr. Kane. After the funeral, Mr. Kane began to take an interest. He was suffocating. He decided we were to be married. When I refused, he made it clear I didn't have a choice. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. It didn't explain the sheer animal terror that had driven her into a deadly storm. It didn't explain why Kane would send a full posse of his hired guns after one reluctant bride. Denish seemed to accept the explanation, though his gaze remained probing. "So you ran?" "I ran," she confirmed. "I was trying to get to Santa Fe. I thought if I could get to the federal marshals." Her voice trailed off. "You wouldn't have made it," Denish said bluntly. "Not on that mare. Kane's men would have had you before you cleared the basin. They're probably still out there now, scouring every coulee and canyon." The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She pulled the blanket tighter. Denish saw the motion. He rose and ladled a bowl of thick rabbit stew, setting it on the small crate next to her cot. "Eat," he commanded again, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Strength is the only currency that matters out here." For the next few days, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the small cabin. Lillian's strength returned, and as she promised, she worked. She mended her torn dress with thread and needle, From Denish's small supply kit, she learned to cook on his stove, and she kept the cabin tidy with a fierceness that suggested she was battling back the chaos of her life, one swept floorboard at a time. Denish was a creature of routine. Up before dawn, he would tend to his few horses, chop wood, and work his small plot of land. He spoke little, but Lillian began to learn his language. A slight nod meant approval. A tightening of his jaw meant he was thinking of something far away. He was watchful constantly, scanning the ridgelines that bordered his valley, his Winchester never far from his hand. He never pried for more of her story, and she was grateful for it. But the space between them was filled with unspoken questions. She would watch him sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, and see a shadow pass over his face, a deep and abiding sorrow that he kept locked away. One night, a scream tore through the cabin. It was Denish. He'd thrashed himself awake, his breathing ragged, his face pale with sweat in the moonlight streaming through the window. Buck whined and nudged his master's hand. Lillian was on her feet in an instant, a poker from the hearth in her hand. "What is it? Are they here?" Denish sat on the edge of his bedroll, his head in his hands. He took a few deep, shuddering breaths before looking up at her. The mask of the stoic homesteader was gone, replaced by a war vulnerability. "A dream," he rasped. "An old one." She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the table, the poker still held loosely in her hand. The kind that feels more real than waking. He nodded, not looking at her. "I was a ranger, down on the Pecos. Got word a gang was hitting homesteads along the river. Led by a ruthless son of a bitch, a man named Riggs. We were a day behind them. We found the Dawson place, or what was left of it. They hadn't just robbed them. They'd—" He trailed off, the memory too ugly for words. "They burned it, with the family inside. I can still hear the mother screaming for her children." His voice was a low, tormented whisper. "We tracked them for 3 days, caught up to them in a box canyon. We got most of them. But Riggs, he was clever. Used the chaos to slip away. I had a shot, a clear shot. But I hesitated for a split second, trying to decide between him and another of his men. And he was gone. I let him go." Lillian listened, her heart aching for this broken man. She now understood the source of the shadows in his eyes. He wasn't just a man who had seen violence. He was a man who blamed himself for failing to stop it. "You can't save everyone, Denish," she said softly. "You save the ones you can." He countered, his voice hard as flint again. "That's the only rule that matters." I broke it. Meanwhile, 20 miles east, in a sprawling adobe ranch house furnished with heavy, dark wood and expensive Mexican tapestries, Bartholomew Kane swirled a glass of brandy. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with cold, calculating eyes and a mouth that was a thin, merciless line. He exuded an aura of immense power and absolute control. And right now he was not in control. Nothing he asked, his voice deceptively calm. A big man with a weathered face and a permanent scowl stood before him, hat in hand. This was Riggs, his chief enforcer. "Mr. Kane, the storm washed out everything. It's like she vanished off the face of the earth," Riggs said, frustration lacing his tone. "We've checked every homestead, every settlement from here to the mountains. No one's seen her. She is not a spirit, Riggs. She is a woman. Women leave tracks. They make mistakes. She has something that belongs to me. and I want it back. I want her back." Kane's voice dropped, losing its cultured veneer for a moment, revealing the predator beneath. Her father, Walter, thought he could be clever. He thought he could document my affairs and threaten me with them. A fatal miscalculation. He took a sip of his brandy. Lillian has his nerve, and she has his ledger. Find the girl. Find the ledger. I don't care what you have to do, who you have to lean on. Burn the entire territory to the ground if you have to. But find her. Riggs nodded. There is one place we ain't checked thorough. That old ranger's homestead up in Pine Valley. McGregor. Kane's eyes narrowed. The recluse. Why there? The day after the storm, one of my boys, young Billy, was scouting the western ridge. He found this. Riggs reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, mud-stained piece of fabric. It was dark blue silk, tangled on a branch, not a mile from McGregor's cabin. Could be a coincidence. Bartholomew Kane stood and walked to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of land he considered his kingdom. I don't believe in coincidences, Riggs. A man who wants to be left alone is a man who is either running from something or hiding something. Pay Mr. McGregor a visit. Be polite at first, but find out what he's hiding. The shadow of Bartholomew Kane was beginning to lengthen, stretching its dark fingers toward the fragile sanctuary in Pine Valley. The air in Pine Valley grew heavier in the week that followed. It wasn't just the late summer heat. It was a palpable tension, a sense that the peace they had found was as thin and fragile as a sheet of ice over a deep river. Denish worked tirelessly, his hands and back occupied with chores, but his eyes were never still. He was watching, waiting. He knew Kane's men would come. It was only a matter of when. Lillian, too, felt the encroaching dread. She saw the way Denish's hand would drift to the butt of his Colt when a deer snapped a twig in the woods, the way his gaze lingered on the trail leading out of the valley each evening. His quiet protection was a comfort, but it was also a constant reminder of the danger she had brought to his door. The guilt gnawed at her. She had given him a half-truth, and now this good, haunted man was putting his life on the line for it. The breaking point came on a blistering afternoon. Denish was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat in the quiet valley. Lillian was hanging laundry on a line, strung between two pines when she saw him. A lone rider silhouetted against the bright sky on the eastern ridge. He wasn't moving, just sitting on his horse, watching, waiting. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran toward Denish, her voice a strangled cry. Denish, the ridge. He didn't need to look. He'd seen the rider minutes ago. He simply embedded his axe in the chopping block and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. His face was a grim mask. "Go inside, Lillian," he said, his voice low and even. "Lock the door. Stay away from the window." "It's them," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "It's Kane's men." "It's one man," Denish corrected. "A scout. He wants us to know he's there. He wants us to be afraid." He looked at her, and his gaze was intense. "Are you yes good? Fear keeps you sharp." He picked up the Winchester that was leaning against the woodpile. "Now get inside." She did as he commanded, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She peeked through a small crack in the shutters, her heart hammering against her ribs. Denish didn't take cover. He just stood by the woodpile rifle held loosely in his hand, a clear and defiant figure in the center of the valley. It was a challenge. I'm here. I'm not hiding. The rider on the ridge watched for another 10 minutes, a silent, ominous sentinel. Then, as slowly as he appeared, he turned his horse and disappeared over the rise. The immediate threat was gone, but the message had been delivered. They were found. That night, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. They ate their meal without a word. The unspoken tension, a third person at the table. Finally, Lillian couldn't bear it any longer. She put down her fork and looked at Danish, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I didn't tell you everything, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Danish leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I know. His simple response disarmed her. You knew a man like Cain doesn't turn a territory upside down for a reluctant bride, he said. There's more. There's always more. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. I should have told you from the start. I was afraid you'd turn me out. That it would be too much. It might be, he said honestly. Try me. She took a deep breath, the story she had held so tightly finally spilling out. My father, Walter Mayfair, wasn't just an employee of Mr. Cain's. He was his bookkeeper, his accountant. My father was a meticulous man, honest. At first he believed Mr. Cain was a great man, building a future for everyone. But then he started to see things. Discrepancies. Payments to men with no names, deeds to ranches signed over under duress, water rights, diverted illegally. Cain wasn't building a future. He was stealing one. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. My father started keeping a second set of books, a small leather ledger where he documented everything. Every crime, every name, every date. He was going to take it to the U.S. Marshals in Santa Fe. But Cain found out. He came to our house with one of his men. He demanded the ledger. My father refused. Lillian's voice broke. Cain had his man beat my father. They told everyone he'd fallen from his horse. A tragic accident. But I was there. I was hiding in the pantry. I saw it all. After they left, I found the ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study, right where he told me he'd keep it safe. She looked at Danish, her expression a mixture of grief and fierce resolve. It's not me he wants, Danish. It's this. She reached into the lining of her mended dress and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped package. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a slim leather-bound book. This ledger is the proof. It's the only thing that can bring him down. That's why I was running. Not from a marriage, but from a murderer. Danish sat forward, his eyes fixed on the ledger. He understood now, the scale of it. This wasn't a personal dispute. This was a war for the soul of the Cimarron territory. The man who was with Cain Danish asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The man who hurt your father, what did he look like? He was big, Lillian said, shivering at the memory. A hard face. A scar that ran down his left cheek from his eye to his jaw. He had a cold, dead look in his eyes. Danish felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows in the corners deepening. The ghost he'd been running from for 3 years had just walked into his cabin. Riggs Danish breathed the name like a curse. Lillian stared at him. You know him. He's the man I told you about. Danish, said his voice a low growl of self-loathing and fury. The man who led the raid on the Dawson family. The man I let get away. The pieces crashed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't two separate events, two separate failures. It was one long, dark story, and he was tangled in the middle of it. His past wasn't just haunting him, it had hunted him down. His failure to stop Riggs years ago had allowed the man to continue his reign of terror to take Lillian's father to become the iron fist of a tyrant like Cain. He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his hands clenched into fists. The quiet homesteader was gone, replaced by the Texas Ranger he used to be. The cold, calculated fury was back. This was no longer just about protecting Lillian. This was about atonement. This was about finishing a job he'd failed years ago. He stopped pacing and looked at Lillian. For the first time, she saw no sorrow in his eyes, no ghosts of the past. She saw a cold, hard purpose. He's not just your enemy anymore. Lillian, Danish said, his voice like bones grinding together. He's mine. He looked from her to the ledger in her hands, and then to the door beyond which the darkness of the valley waited. Cain and Riggs made a mistake. They followed you here. They brought their war to my front door. They think they've cornered you. He picked up his gun belt from its peg and began strapping it on the familiar weight of the Colt settling on his hip. They haven't... He finished, his voice ringing with grim finality. They've cornered me. The morning after the revelation, the valley felt different. The air was charged, the quiet no longer peaceful but predatory. Danish was no longer just a homesteader. He was a strategist. The decision had been made. There would be no more running. The stand would be made here in this valley on this land he had carved out for himself. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. Cain had money and men. Danish had a rifle, a pistol, and a woman with a ledger. It wasn't enough. You need to ride out, Lillian said, watching him check the loads in his Winchester. You need to take the ledger and get to Santa Fe. I'll stay here. They want the book, not the bait. Danish shook his head, not looking up from his task. No. First, they'd get the truth of its location out of you one way or another. Second, Cain would have riders watching every trail to Santa Fe. I'd be shot out of the saddle before I got 10 miles. And third, he finally looked at her, his winter sky eyes holding hers. I'm not leaving you. The finality in his voice silenced her protest. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign and yet so welcome after months of terror. It was the feeling of not being alone. So what? Then she asked. We can't fight a dozen men ourselves. No. Danish agreed. But Cain's power is built on fear. You take away the fear, the whole rotten structure comes down. There are people in redemption, good people that Cain has wronged. He's squeezed them, stolen from them, threatened them. They hate him, but they're too scared to stand up alone. You think you can convince them? I have to try, he said. I'm riding to redemption, not to the town square, but to one man. If I can convince him, we might have a chance. He slung a saddlebag over his shoulder. Barricade the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Use the shotgun if you have to. You know how? She nodded, her expression grim. Point and pull the trigger. That's the idea. He paused at the door. Lillian, this is my fight now too. You understand? She gave him a small, determined smile. I understand. Be careful, Danish. He mounted his sturdy buckskin and rode out, not along the main trail, but through the dense woods and rocky game trails, he knew like the back of his hand. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, his years as a ranger serving him well. He skirted the town of Redemption, a place festering under Cain's thumb, and made his way to a small, isolated house on its outskirts. This was the home and office of Brody Jones. Brody had once been the sheriff of Cimarron County, a lawman of legendary integrity. But years of fighting a losing battle against the tide of corruption, culminating in Cain's complete takeover, had left him weary. He'd retired or been forced out, and now lived a quiet life, his badge and his fight packed away. Denish found him in his yard mending a fence. Brody was older now, his hair completely white and his shoulders stooped, but his eyes, when he looked up and saw Denish, were as sharp as ever. McGregor Brody said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He leaned on his fence post. "Don't see you down from your mountain perch often. Don't tell me you've come to get sociable." "Not today," Brody Denish said, dismounting. "I've come to ask you to break the law." Brody's eyebrows shot up. "Cain's law, you mean? Son, everything a good man does in this territory breaks Cain's law." "What's the trouble?" For the next hour, standing in the hot sun, next to a half-mended fence, Denish laid it all out. Lillian Mayfair, her father's murder, Riggs and the ledger. He watched Brody's face as he spoke, saw the old lawman's hands clench on the fence post, saw the spark of the old fight rekindle in his tired eyes. When Denish was finished, Brody was silent for a long time, staring toward the town he used to protect. "Cain," he finally said, the name thick with disgust. "I always knew he was a snake. I just never had the proof to hang him. And Riggs, I remember when you rode in after that business with the Dawsons. I saw what it did to you. This is a chance to make it right," Brody Denish urged. "For the Dawsons, for Walter Mayfair, for this whole territory." "It's suicide," Denish Brody said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's you, me and the girl against Cain's private army. Not just us," Denish countered. "What about Daniel Weaver, the blacksmith? Cain stole his grandfather's homestead claim with a forged deed. And Patrick O'Connell. Cain's men diverted the creek and dried up his pasture, forced him to sell his cattle for pennies on the dollar. They hate him as much as we do. But they need a leader. They need to know they're not alone." Brody looked at Denish, a long, assessing gaze. He saw the fire in the younger man, the same fire he'd once had. He sighed a deep, rattling sound, and it felt like years of weariness were being expelled with it. "Daniel Weaver is stubborn as a mule, and Patrick O'Connell has a temper that could curdle milk," Brody said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "There'll be a handful." He stuck out his hand. "All right, son, I'm in. Let's go kick over the anthill and see who comes running." Their first stop was the blacksmith shop. Daniel Weaver, a mountain of a man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin, listened to their story with his arms crossed, his expression grim. When they finished, he simply turned, took a brand new, perfectly balanced throwing axe from a hook, and handed it to Denish. "My brother was a ranger," he said. "He always said you were one of the good ones. Just tell me who to hit." Patrick O'Connell, a wiry Irishman with fiery red hair, was harder to convince. He was beaten down, his spirit nearly broken. But when Brody Jones laid out the contents of the ledger, detailing the exact date Cain had paid a man to dynamite the creek bed, O'Connell's despair turned to white-hot rage. "That murdering thief," he roared. "I'll see him in hell for that." He grabbed a vintage Sharps rifle from over his mantle. "I've got 20 rounds for this. I'll make every one count." By nightfall, Dinesh had his army. It wasn't much an ex-ranger, a retired sheriff, a blacksmith, and a rancher. 4 men against Kane's force. But they were men with nothing left to lose, fighting for their homes and their honor. Back at the cabin, Lillian hadn't been idle. She hadn't just barricaded the door. She had helped prepare for a siege. She'd carried water from the spring, stacked ammunition by the windows, and familiarized herself with the shotgun Dinesh had left her. When she heard Dinesh's quiet signal, the call of a whippoorwill, she eagerly unbarred the door. She was surprised to see 3 other men with him. Brodie Jones gave her a respectful nod. "Ma'am, looks like you've brought the reckoning to redemption. We're honored to be a part of it." As the men fortified the cabin, boarding up windows and setting up firing positions, Lillian took on the role of quartermaster. She made a massive pot of coffee and stew, ensuring the men would be fed and ready. She saw the way Dinesh watched her, a look of pride and something deeper in his eyes. This was no longer just his fight or her flight. It was their stand. The ledger was now their flag. They weren't just outlaws fighting a tyrant. They were deputies in a higher court of justice. The cabin in Pine Valley had transformed from a sanctuary into a fortress. And as the moon rose over the silent, watching ridges, they waited for the war to begin. Dawn in Pine Valley was a masterpiece of quiet beauty, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the eastern ridge, setting the dew-kissed pines ablaze with golden light. But on this morning, the beauty was a cruel joke. It illuminated the figures assembling on that same ridge, at least 15 riders' dark silhouettes against the rising sun. At their head were 2 men, one impeccably dressed on a fine black stallion, the other a hulking shape on a powerful roan. Kane and Riggs. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat. 15, Patrick O'Connell muttered from his post at a side window, his knuckles white on his Sharps rifle. "Saints preserve us. 15 men who are paid to be here," Dinesh said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're fighting for our homes, don't forget that." He looked at each man. "Brodie, you and Patrick take the west window. Daniel the back door. I'll take the front. Lillian, you stay low in the center of the room. Keep the ammunition ready. This is it." Lillian nodded, her face pale, but her expression resolute. She had the heavy shotgun resting on a crate beside her, along with spare boxes of shells for the rifles. She was no longer a victim. She was a soldier in this small, desperate army. Outside, Bartholomew Kane raised a hand, and his men dismounted, spreading out to form a wide semicircle around the cabin, using the trees and rocks for cover. He had expected this. He knew McGregor was a ranger. He knew he wouldn't be taken easily. McGregor Kane's voice, amplified by the morning quiet, boomed across the clearing. "You have proven to be a considerable nuisance. I am a reasonable man. Send out the girl and the property she stole, and I will let you and your misguided friends live." Dinesh stepped up to the reinforced door. "The only thing coming out of this cabin is Justice Kane," he yelled back. "You should have stayed in Texas, Riggs. I've got a debt to pay you." A single shot from Riggs's rifle splintered the door frame next to Dinesh's head. The battle had begun. The next hour was a cacophony of thunderous noise. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the sharp crack of rifles and the boom of shotguns echoing through the valley. Kane's men were professionals, advancing methodically, laying down suppressing fire. But Denish's small crew were fighting on their own ground. Every rock, every tree was a known variable. Daniel Weaver, the blacksmith, proved to be a force of nature. When two of Cain's men tried to rush the back door, he kicked it open, roared like a grizzly, and hurled one of his perfectly balanced axes with terrifying accuracy, embedding it in the chest of the lead man. The second man faltered, and a blast from Weaver's shotgun sent him sprawling. From the west window, Brodie and O'Connell worked like a well-oiled machine. Brodie, the old sheriff, would call out targets with calm precision, and O'Connell, his rage now channeled into a cold focus, would send a heavy round from his Sharps rifle to punch through their cover. Denish was the anchor. From the front he fired with methodical, deadly efficiency, never wasting a shot. He drove back any attempt to get close to the cabin, his peacemaker and Winchester, speaking a language Cain's men understood perfectly. But they were heavily outnumbered, for every one of Cain's men that fell. Two more seemed to take his place, their shots chipping away at the cabin's defenses, splintering wood, shattering the few remaining panes of glass. O'Connell cried out, clutching a shoulder as a stray bullet grazed him. Lillian crawled to him, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice steady, despite the chaos. Her terror had been burned away, leaving behind a core of pure steel. Riggs, seeing their defense, was too strong for a direct assault, decided on a more brutal tactic. Under the cover of heavy fire, he and another man crept toward the stable, a small structure a dozen yards from the cabin. Denish saw the movement too late. The stable, he yelled. A moment later, smoke began to pour from its open door. They were trying to burn them out, to use the fire as a screen to charge the cabin. The whinnies of Denish's terrified horses were a gut-wrenching sound. It was in that moment of distraction that Riggs made his move. He broke from the cover of the burning stable, sprinting directly for the cabin's blind spot on the east side, a place where the angle of the window left a small section of the wall uncovered. He was going to breach the wall itself. Denish swung his rifle around, but two other men opened fire, forcing him to duck back. He was pinned down. Riggs is at the east wall. Brodie and O'Connell couldn't get a clear shot. Daniel Weaver was still holding the back. They were exposed. Lillian saw it all. She saw Denish pinned. She heard the heavy thuds as Riggs began to slam his shoulder against the log wall, trying to break through a section chinked with mud and moss. She looked at the shotgun in her hands. She looked at the east wall. There was no window, but there was a small gun port barely large enough for a rifle barrel that they hadn't been using. Without a second thought, she crawled toward it. The noise was deafening, the smell of gunpowder and smoke thick in her throat. She pushed the barrel of the heavy shotgun through the port. Through the narrow slit, she could see him, Riggs, his back to her, preparing for another charge at the wall. It was the same broad back, the same man she had seen standing over her father's broken body. A cold, cleansing rage filled her. This was for her father. This was for the Dawsons. This was for Denish. She pulled both triggers. The roar of the shotgun inside the small cabin was apocalyptic. The double load of buckshot tore through the wooden wall at close range, hitting Riggs squarely in the back. He was thrown forward, a guttural cry ripped from his throat before he collapsed in a heap, motionless. The sudden shocking death of his chief enforcer seemed to break the will of Cain's men. Their firing faltered. From his vantage point, Cain saw Riggs fall. He saw his attack crumbling, his face, usually a mask of cold control, twisted into a snarl of pure fury. Drawing his own silver-inlaid pistol, he stood up from behind his cover. "Useless fools," he screamed, and began firing wildly at the cabin. It was the opening Denish had been waiting for. With the suppressing fire diminished, he stepped into the doorway, brought his Winchester to his shoulder, and took a steady bead on the one man who started it all. For a split second, their eyes met across the bullet-scarred clearing. Kane, the tyrant whose world was collapsing, and Danish, the man who had found his redemption in the heart of that chaos. Danish's rifle cracked once. Bartholomew Kane staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark red stain blooming on his pristine white shirt, then dropped his pistol and crumpled to the ground. A stunned silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the burning stable and Patrick O'Connell's pained groans. The remaining gunmen, their leaders dead, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. It was over. Brodie and Daniel herded the prisoners, while Danish went to O'Connell, quickly assessing his wound. "It's clean through. You'll live, you stubborn Irishman." Danish then turned and looked at Lillian. She was still on the floor, the heavy shotgun lying beside her, her face smudged with soot. He walked over and knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. They were trembling now, the adrenaline finally leaving her. "You did it, Lillian," he said softly. "You ended it." She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering. "We ended it." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tightly as the weight of what they had just survived settled upon them. He breathed in the scent of her hair, smoke, and cordite, and something that was just her, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He looked over her shoulder at the valley, his valley now quiet and safe. He saw the surviving horses that had been freed from the stable grazing nervously. He saw the sun rising higher, promising a new day. And he saw Lillian, the woman in his arms, the woman who had brought a war to his doorstep and given him a reason to fight it. He had looked at her that first night and seen his future. Now, in the aftermath of blood and fire, he knew what that future was. It wasn't just about peace and quiet anymore. It was about building something, a home, a life, a place where the ledger of the past was finally balanced and a new one could begin. And so in the heart of the Cimarron territory, a war ended and a future began. The fall of Bartholomew Kane, brought about by the courage of a few good people and the irrefutable truth of a simple leather ledger, sent shockwaves through the region. The town of Redemption was reborn, this time in spirit as well as in name. Brodie Jones, with a fire reignited in his soul, pinned on a new badge, and began the long work of rebuilding a community based on justice, not fear. For Danish and Lillian, the battle was over, but their story was just starting. They found more than just safety in each other's arms. They found a shared strength, a partnership forged in foi and loyalty. Their love story wasn't written in whispered sonnets, but in shared resolve, quiet understanding, and the promise of every sunrise over their peaceful valley. If this story of redemption, courage, and the untamed heart of the American West resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share it with a friend who loves a real tale of grit and destiny, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories from the frontier to share with you, tales of legendary lawmen, unsung heroes, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to build a future in a wild land. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, and we'll see you on the next dusty trail.